Welcome back to Cinema Screen. Today we're exploring a thrilling 1993 action, drama, and mystery film, The Fugitive. This is a movie that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Be warned, spoilers are ahead. Proceed with caution and enjoy the journey. The story begins with a scene showing the murder of a woman inside a house. Soon after, two detectives arrest Richard Kimble, a doctor who was in the house, as the prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Helen Kimble. The narrative then flashes back to earlier that day, just hours before the murder. In this flashback, Richard and Helen are seen attending a children's fund event organized by Devon McGregor Pharmaceuticals at the Four Seasons Hotel. During the event, Richard's close friend, Dr. Charles Nichols, introduces him to a man named Alex Lentz. After the event, Richard and Helen leave the hotel to return home. While driving home, Richard receives an urgent call from his hospital, requesting his assistance with an emergency surgery. He drops Helen off at their house and heads back to the hospital. Upon his arrival, Richard learns that a patient had been admitted by someone named Lentz, and that the patient's liver is failing due to being clogged with blood. Furthermore, Richard discovers that the patient had taken a drug called RDU-90, which had been manufactured by Devon McGregor Pharmaceuticals. The scene transitions back to the present, where the detectives are interrogating Richard. During the questioning, Richard recounts all the events that took place before the murder. He states that upon returning home from the hospital, he saw a man with a prosthetic right arm inside the house. This man was upstairs, and though Richard fought with him, the intruder managed to escape. However, all the evidence found at the crime scene points to Richard as the murderer. Consequently, after a trial, the court convicts Richard and sentences him to death by lethal injection. Later, Richard, Copeland, and several other prisoners are being transported to prison on a bus. During the journey, an altercation among the prisoners results in a guard being shot. This causes the bus to veer off the road and overturn on a railway track. One of the guards unlocks Richard's handcuff so he can assist an injured officer, while this time, with a train rapidly approaching, Copeland and another guard escape. Richard helps the injured guard out of the bus just in time before the train crashes into it, causing a catastrophic derailment. Richard and Copeland survive the ordeal and escape separately, each seeking freedom. Meanwhile, U.S. Marshal Samuel Gerard and his team arrive at the crash site to investigate. Speaking to the local sheriff, Gerard learns that the sheriff believes all the prisoners have died in the crash. However, Gerard and his team find evidence indicating that both Richard and Copeland survived, prompting them to begin a manhunt. The next morning, Richard, now on the run, changes out of his prison uniform and disguises himself as someone delivering supplies to a hospital. Once inside, he treats his own injuries and shaves off his beard to alter his appearance. Disguised as a doctor, Richard leaves the hospital and escapes in an ambulance. Meanwhile, Gerard and his team discover that Richard has fled in the ambulance, and they set off in pursuit. As Richard continues his escape, police vehicles and a helicopter carrying Samuel pursue the ambulance he is driving. Richard speeds through the roads, attempting to evade capture. Eventually, he drives into a tunnel near Dam, where he sees that the police have set up a roadblock at the exit. Realizing he cannot continue, Richard stops the ambulance and enters the dam's water drainage system. Samuel and his team soon reach the abandoned ambulance. Upon finding it empty, Samuel, along with Cosmo and Robert, follows Richard into the drainage system. Inside, the group splits up, with Samuel proceeding alone. At one point, Samuel descends further into the system, but slips and falls, dropping his gun. Richard, nearby, picks up the gun and confronts Samuel, stating, "I didn't kill my wife." Samuel, however, dismisses this claim. Cornered, Richard has no choice but to leap off the dam into the water below. When Cosmo later arrives and asks about Richard's whereabouts, Samuel replies that Richard jumped. Despite the dangerous fall, Richard survives. He emerges from the reservoir and escapes into the surrounding area, evading the police who are searching for him. That night, exhausted and soaked, Richard hides and rests until morning. Meanwhile, Samuel and his team continue their search. The next day, Richard dyes his hair black to alter his appearance. Around the same time, Samuel and his team track down Copeland to his hideout. Disguised, they approach the house. However, when Copeland attempts to kill one of Samuel's officers, Samuel shoots and kills Copeland to protect his team. Meanwhile, Richard makes his way to Chicago, where he contacts his friend and legal advisor, Walter, requesting money. However, Walter refuses to help Richard. This phone call, recorded by Samuel and his team, provides an important clue. By carefully analyzing the recording, they identify the sound of an elevated train in the background, confirming that Richard is in Chicago. Meanwhile, Richard meets his close friend Charles and asks for some money. After receiving the funds, he leaves and uses the money to secure a temporary place to stay. Samuel, now certain that Richard has returned to Chicago, informs the Chicago Police Department and requests their assistance in capturing him. Later, Richard visits Cook County Hospital, where he steals the ID of a staff member. Meanwhile, Samuel questions Charles about Richard's whereabouts. Charles admits to meeting Richard near a tennis club earlier that morning and giving him a small amount of money. Samuel seeks Charles's help in capturing Richard, but Charles refuses, stating that he believes Richard is innocent. Using the stolen ID, Richard replaces the photo with his own and purchases a uniform similar to that worn by the hospital staff. Samuel and his team, on the other hand, visit the hospital where Richard used to work and question everyone he was associated with. They all assert that Richard is a good person and express doubt about his involvement in any crime. At the same time, Richard continues investigating the person who wore the prosthetic hand and murdered his wife. Samuel also digs deeper into Helen's murder by visiting Richard's home to look for clues. The next morning, Richard is awakened by the sound of police vehicles arriving near his hideout. Terrified, he prepares to flee, but quickly realizes the house is surrounded. He stays in his room, trying to avoid detection. The police enter the house and arrest a male occupant, accusing him of being a drug dealer. Richard remains unnoticed. That night, Richard sneaks into the Cook County Hospital disguised as a janitor. While cleaning the prosthetics and orthotics department, he accesses their records. Using the information from his investigation, he identifies 5 individuals whose prosthetic hands match the details he had uncovered. He collects their names, addresses, and contact numbers for further investigation. The man arrested at the house where Richard was hiding informs the Chicago police that Richard is staying on the ground floor of the house. This information is relayed to Samuel, who immediately investigates Richard's room. Upon examining it, Samuel realizes that Richard is currently at Cook County Hospital. Meanwhile, Richard, having gathered the information he needed, prepares to leave the hospital. However, a doctor named Anne asks him to assist with a male child in severe pain by escorting him to the observation room. Richard examines the child's X-ray report, determines the necessary treatment, and the child is safely handed over to the appropriate staff. As he prepares to leave, Anne encounters him again and recognizes him. She attempts to alert security, but Richard quickly escapes. Later, Samuel arrives at the hospital and questions Anne. She tells him that Richard saved the boy's life, highlighting his skill and integrity. Samuel and his team then deduce that Richard came to the hospital to gather information about Helen's killer, who likely wore a prosthetic right hand. Richard, using the details he collected about individuals with prosthetic hands, starts calling each one to gather information. During this process, he learns that one of the individuals, Clive Driscoll, was previously arrested for armed robbery. Believing Clive might be the killer, Richard decides to confront him. Simultaneously, Samuel and his team also investigate individuals with prosthetic right hands and their criminal records. They, too, discover Clive's involvement in past crimes and head to the location where he is being held. When Richard meets Clive, he realizes Clive is not the person he is looking for. Disappointed, Richard leaves the location just as Samuel arrives. Samuel spots Richard and gives chase. In the pursuit, Samuel fires at Richard, but Richard manages to escape unharmed. Richard uses the chaos of a St. Patrick's Day parade happening nearby to blend into the crowd and once again evades capture, slipping away unnoticed. The following day, Richard attempts to call the last person on his list, Sykes, but the call goes unanswered. Determined to uncover the truth about his wife's killer, Richard sneaks into Sykes's house, using the address he had obtained. Once inside, Richard examines Sykes's photographs and immediately realizes that Sykes must be Helen's murderer. As Richard continues searching the house, he uncovers evidence linking Helen's murder to the Devon MacGregor Corporation, a pharmaceutical company that had supported the Children's Fund program. Using the phone in Sykes's house, Richard calls Samuel and informs him that he has found significant evidence related to Helen's murder. After the call, Richard leaves the house while keeping the line active. Samuel and his team trace the call and arrive at Sykes's house. Upon entering, they begin searching the premises. During their search, Sykes himself returns home. Samuel questions him directly, asking if he knows Richard Kimble. Sykes denies knowing Richard personally. Samuel then presses Sykes further, asking where he was on the night of Helen's murder. Sykes responds that he was working a security detail for Devin McGregor and was out of Chicago that night. After completing their questioning, Samuel and his team leave Sykes' house. However, they assign several police officers to investigate Sykes further and monitor his activities near his home. Later, Richard contacts Charles and informs him that Helen's murder is connected to the Devin McGregor pharmaceutical company and Lentz. He explains that their target has been him all along because he uncovered that RDU-90, a drug developed under Lentz's supervision, causes liver damage. Charles, in response, mentions that Lentz died in a car accident last summer. When Charles asks if Richard can prove his claims about RDU-90, Richard confidently asserts that he can. Meanwhile, Samuel meets Charles and shows him a photograph of Sykes and Lentz, asking if Charles recognizes them. Charles denies knowing either of them. Shortly afterward, Sykes receives a phone call from someone and, after the conversation, retrieves his gun. At the same time, 2 fire trucks arrive at Sykes' house. Taking advantage of the commotion, Sykes evades the officers Samuel had stationed outside and manages to leave the house undetected. Elsewhere, Richard collects a sample from a liver patient who had been treated with RDU-90 and takes it to Dr. Kathy for analysis. Upon examining the sample, Richard realizes that Charles is deeply involved in the entire conspiracy. Simultaneously, Samuel discovers that Charles lied about not knowing Lentz. He learns that Charles was actually Lentz's superior. That night, Sykes tracks down Richard and follows him onto a train. As Richard rides the train, a passenger recognizes him and alerts a police officer on board. Meanwhile, Sykes approaches Richard, armed with his gun. When the police officer arrives at the scene, Sykes shoots him. Taking advantage of the chaos, Richard attacks Sykes, disarms him, and escapes from the train. Samuel and the Chicago police are quickly informed of the incident and intensify their efforts to capture Richard. Richard, now armed with Sykes' gun, places it in a mailbox for safekeeping. He then makes his way to the Hilton Tower Mall, determined to find Charles and expose the truth. Richard enters the Hilton Tower Mall and confronts Charles, who is delivering a presentation on RDU-90. Meanwhile, Samuel and the police arrive at the building and seal all exits, intent on capturing Richard. Interrupting Charles's presentation, Richard creates a scene, and the confrontation escalates. As both men leave the conference hall, Charles attacks Richard, leading to a fierce fight that moves through the building and eventually onto the roof. On the rooftop, a helicopter arrives, urging Richard to surrender. However, Richard refuses and is fired upon. Samuel, who has reached the rooftop, orders the shooting to stop. Taking advantage of the brief pause, Richard resumes his pursuit of Charles, landing blows during their struggle. The fight leads to a glass-covered section of the roof, which collapses, causing both men to fall onto a lift below. The lift lowers to the 5th floor, where the laundry area is located. Charles exits first and attempts to flee, but Richard soon follows to continue his pursuit. At the same time, Cosmo and Samuel also arrive at the laundry floor, searching for both Richard and Charles. During the confrontation, Samuel presents evidence that proves Richard's innocence and Charles's guilt. Realizing the truth, Samuel prepares to arrest Charles. However, Charles reacts violently, attacking Cosmo and stealing his gun. Charles then aims at Samuel, preparing to shoot, but Richard intervenes and stops him by force. In the aftermath, Richard tells Samuel that Charles and his accomplices were responsible for Helen's murder. Samuel responds, "I know," indicating he has accepted Richard's innocence. Shortly after, Charles and Sykes are taken into custody. As the chaos subsides, Samuel escorts Richard to his car, removes his handcuffs, and Samuel's car drives away from the scene. The movie concludes with Richard finally vindicated, bringing the action-packed and suspenseful story to a close. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more exciting movie breakdowns, and see you in the next one.